You wake up, check your account balance, and everything appears perfectly fine. The numbers are stable, your risk is meticulously under control, and you followed every single rule yesterday, but something feels fundamentally wrong, and you can't quite explain what it is. This isn't the intense panic you felt when you were blowing accounts 6 months ago, and it's certainly not the raw excitement you felt when you first started seeing consistent results. This is different, and it's arguably worse because you don't know what you're supposed to fix. You're executing your setups exactly as planned. Your win rate hovers around where it should be, and you're not making any obvious mistakes. But the fire is gone, and each day at the charts feels like you're going through motions that don't mean anything anymore. You tell yourself this is just a natural part of the process, and that true consistency takes time. But the doubt creeps in anyway because nothing feels like it's actually building towards something real. What makes this stage so dangerous is that you can't point to a single thing that's broken. When you were losing money, at least you knew exactly what needed to change. When you were learning, at least you could feel yourself getting better with every lesson. But right now, you're stuck in a place where the path forward is invisible, and the only thing you know for certain is that staying here much longer might break you in ways that losing money never did. If you don't understand this phase, you'll either quit too early or stay stuck in it for years, never realizing that the problem wasn't your strategy or your discipline, but something else entirely that nobody talks about because it doesn't fit into the typical trading journey narrative. The strangest part about this phase is how normal everything looks from the outside. Your journal entries are clean, your trades make sense when you review them, and if someone asked you to explain your edge, you could do it without hesitation. You're not gambling anymore, you're not revenge trading, and you're definitely not making the rookie mistakes that used to drain your account every other week. But when you sit down to trade, there's this weight that wasn't there before. You click through your watch list and nothing excites you. Even when a perfect setup forms exactly as you've been waiting for, the thrill is absent. You enter the trade because that's what the plan says to do, and you manage it correctly all the way through, but the whole experience feels hollow, like you're performing a ritual that lost its meaning somewhere along the way. What's happening is that you've moved past the phase where every trade felt important, but you haven't yet reached the phase where trading feels natural. You're caught in between, and your mind doesn't know how to process because there's no clear enemy to fight. The market isn't attacking you, your emotions aren't sabotaging you, and your system isn't failing you. You're just existing in this strange limbo where nothing confirms you're on the right path, but nothing proves you're on the wrong one either. This is the phase most traders misinterpret, and that's why it hurts so much, because the pain doesn't come with instructions on how to fix it. When you were losing money, the feedback loop was immediate and brutal. You made a bad decision, the market punished you, and you could see exactly where things went wrong. That kind of pain is sharp and clear, and your brain knows what to do with it because the cause and effect relationship is obvious. You adjust, you learn, you move forward with new information that makes you slightly better than you were before. But this phase operates differently. What makes it so insidious is the complete absence of meaningful feedback. You're doing everything right, at least according to all the rules and principles you've internalized, but the market isn't rewarding you in any way that feels significant. Sure, you might be slowly growing your account, but the emotional experience of that growth is flat, almost numb, and that numbness starts to feel like evidence that something must be wrong. Your mind begins searching for explanations because humans are pattern-seeking machines. When we can't find a pattern in our external results, we turn inward and create narratives that might not be true. You start wondering if your edge has degraded, if the market has changed in some subtle way you're not detecting, or if you were fooling yourself all along about your ability to do this. These thoughts feel rational because they're trying to solve a problem, but the problem they're solving doesn't actually exist. What you're really experiencing is the discomfort of not knowing whether your effort matters. And that's a fundamentally different kind of pain than losing money. Losses at least feel meaningful because they tell you something concrete about what doesn't work. But when you're following your process and nothing feels like it's moving in either direction, your brain interprets that ambiguity as potential danger, which triggers all the same stress responses as actual failure without giving you anything specific to fight against. The worst part is that this phase can last months, sometimes longer. And during that entire time, you're showing up, doing the work, and getting almost no emotional payoff for it. Every day becomes a quiet test of whether you can keep going when there's no evidence that keeping going makes any difference. And that's when the real psychological battle begins, because you're no longer fighting the market, you're fighting uncertainty about yourself. When traders hit this phase, they almost always make one of two mistakes, and both of them feel completely justified at the time. The first reaction is to force progress, to create the feeling of forward momentum, even if it means abandoning the very process that got you to this point. You start looking for new setups because maybe your current ones are the problem, or you increase your position size because maybe the issue is that your wins aren't big enough to feel meaningful. You find yourself watching more charts, taking more trades, and tweaking your rules in small ways that seem harmless but actually undermine the consistency you've been building. Every change feels like an experiment, like you're being proactive and adaptive, but what's really happening is that you're trying to manufacture the feeling of control in a situation where control isn't the issue. The market doesn't care that you're bored or frustrated, and adding complexity won't make the ambiguity go away. Some traders go even further and completely switch strategies, convincing themselves that the problem is their approach rather than their relationship with the process. They chase the new thing because the new thing comes with hope and excitement. And those feelings are so much easier to deal with than the quiet discomfort of not knowing if what you're doing matters. But what they don't realize is that every time they restart, they're just postponing the inevitable encounter with this same phase, because this phase isn't about the strategy at all. The second reaction looks smarter on the surface, but it's just as destructive in its own way. Instead of forcing progress, some traders emotionally withdraw from the process while technically still following it. They keep trading. They keep managing risk. They keep logging everything in their journal, but they've disconnected from it internally. The work becomes mechanical, something they do because they're supposed to, not because they believe in it anymore. This withdrawal feels safer than forcing progress because at least you're not making reckless changes, but the resentment builds anyway. You start to hate the routine, hate the charts, hate the fact that you're putting in all this effort for results that feel meaningless. The discipline that used to be your strength becomes a cage. And you follow the rules not because you trust them, but because breaking them would mean admitting that this whole thing was a waste of time. What makes both of these reactions so dangerous is that they both feel responsible. Forcing progress feels like taking action, and emotional withdrawal feels like protecting yourself. And in most areas of life, those would be reasonable responses to a problem. But trading isn't like most areas of life. This phase specifically exists to test whether you can sit with discomfort without needing to fix it, change it, or numb yourself to it. This is why smart traders get stuck longer than beginners. Because beginners don't know enough to question themselves this deeply, but smart traders have just enough knowledge to create elaborate justifications for abandoning the path right before it would have actually worked. What this phase is actually testing has nothing to do with your ability to read charts or manage risk or execute a plan. You've already proven you can do those things, and that's exactly why you're here in the first place. If you were still making obvious mistakes, you'd have obvious things to fix, and you wouldn't be in this strange place where everything looks right but feels wrong. No, this phase is testing something deeper, something that most trading education completely ignores because it's hard to teach and impossible to shortcut. This phase is testing your relationship with uncertainty, and specifically whether you can function effectively when uncertainty doesn't resolve. Every trade you take is uncertain. That part never changes. But in the beginning, that uncertainty had a different quality to it. You were learning. So even the uncertainty felt productive because each outcome taught you something. But now you're past the learning curve, at least for the basics. And the uncertainty you face is the kind that doesn't offer lessons, doesn't provide closure, and doesn't validate your effort in any tangible way. Can you execute your edge without needing emotional payoff from each individual trade? Can you respect your rules without getting validation from the results? Can you stay present and engaged when nothing about the experience feels rewarding? These are the questions this phase is asking, and they're not theoretical questions. Your answer comes through in your behavior every single day, in whether you show up the same way when you're up 3% for the month or flat for 3 months in a row. What makes this so difficult is that most of us were conditioned to expect that doing the right thing produces feelings of progress and accomplishment. In school, studying hard led to better grades. At work, putting in effort led to promotions or recognition. Even in the early stages of trading, learning more led to fewer mistakes, and fewer mistakes led to better results. The feedback loop was there, and it reinforced the idea that correct action produces positive feelings. But that relationship breaks down in this phase. You are doing the right thing, but it doesn't feel like the right thing, and your brain interprets that mismatch as a warning sign that something must be off. The trap is believing that warning sign when nothing is actually wrong. And that's where most traders break. Not because the market beat them, but because they couldn't tolerate the absence of confirmation that their effort mattered. This is where authority in trading actually comes from. Not from having a high win rate or managing a large account, but from developing the capacity to function in ambiguity without needing it to resolve into clarity. That capacity can't be taught through rules or principles. It can only be built through direct experience. And the experience required is exactly what you're going through right now. Even though it feels like you're stuck rather than building anything, there's an invisible skill being constructed during this phase. And most traders never recognize it because they're too focused on what they think they should be improving. They believe they need better entries, faster recognition of patterns, more sophisticated risk management, or deeper understanding of market structure. Those things might help at the margins, but they're not what separates consistently profitable traders from everyone else. The real skill being built is tolerance. Specifically, tolerance for the emotional experience of doing everything right and having nothing dramatic happen. Consistency in trading doesn't come from confidence, at least not the kind of confidence people imagine when they think about successful traders. It comes from the ability to execute your process when you feel nothing, when the work seems pointless, when every part of you wants evidence that this is leading somewhere and the market refuses to provide it. Confidence is a lagging indicator, something that emerges after you've already developed tolerance and proven to yourself that you can maintain your standards without external reinforcement. But tolerance is what you build in the trenches in the months where you're showing up and taking your setups and managing your trades exactly as planned while your internal experience is telling you that none of it matters. That gap between what you're doing and what you're feeling is where the skill gets forged. What nobody tells you is that this skill is more valuable than any edge or strategy or technical knowledge you could acquire. Because once you have it, changing markets don't break you, drawdowns don't shake you, and the inevitable periods of underperformance don't send you spiraling into self-doubt. You become steady not because you're always winning, but because your internal state is no longer dependent on external validation. And that steadiness is what allows you to stay in the game long enough for the probabilities to actually work in your favor. The traders who make it through this phase don't escape it through some breakthrough insight or by finally finding the perfect strategy. They outgrow it quietly, so gradually that they often don't notice it's happening until they look back and realize that the weight they used to carry isn't there anymore. The shift happens through accumulated experience of showing up consistently without reward. And eventually, that consistency rewrites something fundamental about how you relate to the work. What changes isn't the market or your strategy, but your expectations about what each trading day is supposed to provide. You stop needing trades to feel important. You stop needing wins to feel validated. And you stop needing the process to confirm that you're on the right path. The work becomes what it is, nothing more and nothing less. And that acceptance is what finally breaks the spell of this phase. The behaviors that signal you're moving through it are subtle and easy to miss. You make fewer promises to yourself about what you're going to accomplish, not because you've lost ambition, but because you've stopped trying to control outcomes that aren't controllable. Your focus narrows to what's directly in front of you rather than projecting forward into some imagined future where everything finally clicks. You start judging your days by whether you followed your process rather than what your profit and loss statement shows. And that shift in measurement changes everything about how you experience the work. Time becomes your ally instead of your enemy because you're no longer in a hurry to prove anything. You let the months accumulate without needing each one to be meaningful. And that patience creates space for the actual skill development that was happening invisibly the whole time. None of this is tactical. None of it involves changing your approach to the market. And that's exactly why it works. Because the problem was never technical in the first place. What's dangerous about this phase is how easily it gets misread, especially by traders who are paying attention to all the wrong signals. From the inside, this phase often feels like regression, like you're somehow getting worse at something you used to understand. The enthusiasm you had when you first found your edge is gone. The excitement of improvement has faded, and what's left is this grinding routine that doesn't seem to be building toward anything. Many traders respond to that feeling by trying to recreate the energy they had in earlier stages. And that's when they make the fatal mistake of going backwards to feel progress again. They start taking trades outside their plan because at least breaking the rules creates some kind of emotional intensity. They increase risk to manufacture the adrenaline they remember from when trading felt exciting. They add new indicators or switch time frames or change their approach entirely. Not because there's evidence these changes will help, but because the change itself feels like movement. The mind plays tricks during this phase, convincing you that if you're not feeling growth, you must not be growing. And if you're not growing, you should try something different. That logic sounds reasonable until you realize that the growth happening right now is specifically the kind that doesn't produce feelings. And abandoning the process to chase those feelings is exactly what prevents the growth from completing. You end up stuck in a loop where you keep restarting before you ever get to find out what would have happened if you just stayed the course. This is why so many traders quit right before things would have stabilized. Not because they couldn't handle the difficulty, but because they couldn't handle how quiet it got. The noise of losing money is loud and obvious, and there's a strange comfort in that clarity, even when it's painful. But this phase strips away all the noise, and what's left is just you and your process with no drama, no validation, and no confirmation that any of it means anything. Most people don't quit because it's hard. They quit because it's quiet, and the silence feels like evidence of failure when it's actually evidence that you're finally doing it right. The shift that signals you're through this phase is so subtle that you might not even notice it happening. You stop checking your results as often, not because you're avoiding them, but because they're no longer the primary way you measure whether you're doing this correctly. The internal arguments about whether your edge is real or whether you should change something start to fade, and they're replaced by a neutral acceptance of whatever the market is doing on any given day. Your decisions feel smaller, less loaded with meaning, because you've stopped treating each trade like it's a referendum on your ability. You take your setups when they appear, manage them according to your plan, and move on to the next one without carrying the emotional residue of what just happened. The process becomes almost boring in its consistency, and that boredom is actually the signal that you've developed the tolerance you needed all along. What's interesting is that success at this level doesn't feel like relief. It doesn't feel like vindication. And it definitely doesn't feel like the triumphant breakthrough you imagined when you were struggling. It feels like neutrality, like you finally stopped fighting something that was never actually your enemy. The market is the market. Your process is your process. And the gap between what you can control and what you can't control becomes so obvious that you stop wasting energy trying to bridge it. This phase doesn't mean you're failing, and it doesn't mean you're broken. It means the noise is finally gone. All the distractions and illusions and false measures of progress have been stripped away. And now your behavior matters in a way it never could when you were still caught up in the drama of trying to force outcomes. The traders who understand this don't try to escape the discomfort. They recognize it as the price of admission to a level of consistency that most people never reach because they couldn't sit still long enough to let it develop. Over time, this neutrality becomes your greatest asset. You begin to see the markets not as a casino or a battlefield, but as a slow, moving river of information. Your job is simply to dip your bucket in when the conditions are right. The desperate need for a big win to justify your existence as a trader vanishes. In its place, a quiet professionalism takes root. You find that your best trading days are the ones where you can barely remember the details of the trades themselves because they were executed with such effortless precision. This is the paradoxical end of the journey. You work your entire life to become a trader so that you can eventually reach a point where trading occupies the smallest possible amount of your emotional energy. You start to notice that your life outside the charts improves as well. Because you are no longer tethered to the fluctuating greens and reds of a screen, you become more present with your family, more focused on your health, and more patient with the world around you. The discipline you forged in the silence of the limbo phase becomes a general life skill. You realize that the ability to stay the course when things are boring or uncertain is the secret to success in almost every human endeavor, not just finance. You stop looking for shortcuts in other areas of your life because you've seen firsthand that the boring path is usually the only one that leads to a real destination. You become the person who can endure the quiet, and in doing so, you become the person the market can no longer defeat. Eventually, you will look back on this period of discomfort as the most important time in your development. It was the cocoon stage where your amateur habits were dissolved and your professional identity was formed. You'll realize that the fire you thought you lost wasn't actually fuel, it was just friction. True power doesn't burn out, it hums steadily in the background, reliable and cool. When you reach this state, you aren't just a person who trades, you are a trader. The distinction is subtle but profound. You have transitioned from seeking wealth to embodying the process that creates it. And once that transition is complete, the money begins to follow not because you're chasing it, but because you've finally become the type of person who is capable of holding on to it. Would you like me to analyze a specific trading journal entry to see if you're currently in this limbo phase?